Hey kids, what's up? Mr. Brotherton here, and I'm going to be talking about regulation and feedback mechanisms. This is concept 2 notes for our homeostasis and body systems unit. All right, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about what keeps you alive. This is going to really rely on those conceptual models we talked about. What's a conceptual model again? It is a drawing or diagram that helps us understand an idea. Okay, it's not actually showing you what's happening, it's just a way of organizing our thoughts around something. So, homeostasis is the stability of the internal environment and the mechanisms that maintain that stability. So this is about that dynamic equilibrium where life can only exist in this narrow range, this balance, and it has to maintain that state. Otherwise, bad things can happen. All right, so organisms need to be able to detect stimuli like what we talked about, but more than that, they need to be able to respond to it. So if a ball was flying right at your face, you would probably not just let it hit you in the face, you would respond and catch that ball. All right, so we do this homeostasis through the regulation of all of these different processes from the system level all the way down to the cellular level. So what I'm showing you here on this slide is that we have to maintain our pH. That's how much hydrogen is floating around in your body. We have to maintain our temperature. Remember I said 2/3 of our energy we eat is actually just maintaining our body temperature, so all of the reactions can take place in our body. And we have to maintain our blood sugar, because if our blood sugar gets too high, it's kind of poison for your brain. All right, so here's a really good conceptual model of how this stuff gets done, and all of this homeostasis gets maintained through feedback mechanisms. What does that mean? Feedback is where the output of a system affects the input of a system, so it feeds back into our system. It is a circle here, it's a conceptual circle. So these mechanisms have evolved to maintain homeostasis, and these loops are very, very, very important because the output of the system signals a change in the input, and that way we can respond to what's happening. And now we can either amplify or increase the inputs, or we can stabilize and decrease the inputs. And we call those things two different things. One is positive feedback and one is negative feedback. So let's talk about negative feedback first, because this is the most abundant type of feedback that's happening in the body. Why? Because it stabilizes situations. So in a negative feedback loop, the output of our system is going to decrease or counter what's happening with the input. And this is going to lead to a set point. So your body has to maintain homeostasis in a narrow window, and we call that narrow window, we can call those things set points. All right, so negative feedback loops lead to stabilization in our system. So what's an example of this so it makes a lot more sense? Well, human body temperature, and we'll get into that in a second. Water concentration, we'll also explain that here in a second. And blood sugar regulation, I think we're going to explain that too. So negative feedbacks are very, very prevalent because they lead to stabilization in the body. That's why they're more prevalent in life, because life has to maintain these very, very narrow balances. All right, and you can also have positive feedback mechanisms. This is where the output is going to amplify or increase our inputs. All right, so it's going to intensify the response. It's going to make it crazy and run off the rails, kind of like a train off the tracks. Okay, it's going to intensify what's happening or amplify what's happening. So what's an example of this? Human childbirth. All right, so hormones cause contractions, contractions cause pressure. That pressure releases more of those hormones, leads to more contractions, more pressure, etc. Okay. So positive feedback, this is like when you have the sound from an amplifier going back into a guitar, then going back out to the amplifier, then going back into the guitar. And so you can imagine that leads to this really intensely loud noise, and it accelerates. It's almost an exponential change. So the same thing has to happen with human childbirth, because you don't want to return to the set point, which is a baby staying inside. That would be very, very bad. You need to get this baby out. So that's why it's a positive feedback loop, where those hormones induce more hormones, more contractions, and it leads to the baby being born. What's another example? Fruit ripening on a tree. So fruit ripens, it releases ethylene. Ethylene signals to other fruit around it, hey, it's time to ripen. Then they ripen, and guess what? They signal to the fruit around them, it's time to ripen, and you imagine that this proceeds until all of the fruit are ripe on our tree. So what do these feedback loops look like conceptually? Well, they all have these kind of things in common. So there's always a receptor that kind of senses what's going on. So in the case of the ball flying towards your face, it's your eyeballs are sensing that, hey, there's a stimulus out here. What's the stimulus? That's an action that needs responding to. And then that receptor sends that signal to a control center. So when the ball is flying to your face, your eye sends that signal to your brain, okay? And then your brain sends that signal to the effector, which is an organ that does the response. So in our case, our effector would be grabbing the ball so it doesn't hit you in the face. What's the response? The response here is that we are now closing our hand around the ball so it doesn't hit us in the face. All right. So let's look at a couple examples here of what feedback loops look like. Okay, so this example, thermoregulation, we talked about, it's a negative feedback loop. So your normal body temperature has to be 37 degrees Celsius. And this part of your brain, the hypothalamus, receives signals from the rest of your body about the temperature and what's going on. So if your temperature is too high, so the stimulus here is that it's really, really hot, your hypothalamus picks that up. And then it tells your sweat glands and your capillaries, hey, you need to do something about this. We're hot. So what do your sweat glands do? They release sweat. What do your capillaries do? They dilate or get bigger. So there's more surface area, and more surface area means more heat can escape. Well, what if it's too cold? Well, the stimulus here is that it's too cold. Your hypothalamus in your brain receives that signal, it's too cold, and it tells your muscles and your capillaries, hey, we got to deal with this. What do? You start to shiver, which generates heat, and your capillaries constrict, so they decrease surface area, and that keeps you warm. Another example, osmoregulation, or how we control water. Okay, so osmolality of human blood is between 275 and 295. So we have to maintain that balance. So once again, you have your hypothalamus receiving the signal, and it tells your pituitary gland, which is the control center here, what to do. So if you have a very, very high concentrated blood, then you release antidiuretic hormone, okay? And that tells your kidney nephron that it needs to do what? Hold on to water and not release it in urine. So if your blood is way, way, way dilute, okay, so it has a low concentration, you release less antidiuretic hormone. So a diuretic is something that makes you go to the bathroom, or so an antidiuretic is something that holds onto water. It keeps you from going to the bathroom. So your kidney nephron is like, okay, I need to do something about this. What's the deal here? Well, you release water into urine, okay? So if you are dehydrated, your body holds on to water. If you're not dehydrated, your body's willing to release water. Okay, another example of a feedback loop, blood sugar regulation. This one's very important because it leads to diabetes if it's messed up. So your pancreas kind of receives these signals. Well, what's going on with your blood sugar? So if your blood sugar is way too high, then beta cells in your pancreas, guess what they do? They start sucking up that sugar by releasing insulin into your blood, and it basically allows your body to soak up that blood sugar and turn it into glycogen. Sorry. What happens if it's too low? Your blood sugar is way too low, then your alpha cells in your pancreas are like, man, we need to release some sugar into our blood because this is bad. So you release the hormone glucagon, which allows your liver cells to start breaking down glycogen, and that releases glucose into your blood, raising your blood sugar level. All right, so feedback loops are very, very, very very important because if a mistake goes bad in a feedback loop, your homeostasis is totally thrown off. You can see that all of these systems, osmoregulation, thermoregulation, and blood sugar regulation, they're all trying to return you to that set point. So the perfect amount of hydration, the perfect amount of blood glucose level, and the perfect temperature. All right. So one example of this is type 1 diabetes. That's when your body stops responding to insulin. Therefore, your blood sugar is always very, very, very high. Another example would be something like Cushing's syndrome. This is where your body has way too much cortisol in your blood, which is a stress hormone, and stress leads to all kinds of negative effects like heart disease, strokes, etc. Right. Another way we maintain homeostasis in the body, one of the really important things that's happening here is that we use something known as enzymes. So these help regulate all of these different chemical reactions we're talking about in the body. So they catalyze reaction. What's a catalyst? It's something that speeds up a reaction, okay? And it doesn't get messed up because it can keep being used over and over again. That's what's really cool about enzymes. And most of these are going to be made of protein, and we'll talk about what proteins look like here in a couple concepts. All right, but every metabolic pathway in your body, so your ability to break down protein, fat, carbohydrates, that's all because of different enzymes. What do enzymes kind of look like, and what are they doing? Well, they're a protein that has a little spot where a reactant or a substrate, as another term for the same thing, can bond to it, and then you can release a new thing, which is a product. All right, so enzymes are not changed in that reaction. They can keep being used over and over and over again. One really good example is catalase, which can break down hydrogen peroxide. It can break down like 40 million hydrogen peroxides in a second, which is insane. All right, so enzymes are very, very specific. They have an active site that fits only one single substrate or reactant, and we can call that the lock and key model. So what I'm showing you there is maybe what an enzyme looks like. Okay, it has an active site where only a certain thing can fit into that active site, and in that case, here is our substrate or reactant. Another good metaphor for this is kind of what's known as the induced fit model, which is kind of like how if you were playing baseball and you had a glove on and you threw a ball, that ball would hit your glove, and then you'd kind of lock around it so that that ball fits perfectly into your glove once you've changed kind of that shape. All right. So what's awesome about enzymes? They break bonds, okay, and they can form products. So one type of enzyme can actually take this thing, which is one big polymer here, and break it down into these smaller monomers. So that's metabolism. That's how you're digesting and transporting things throughout your body. All right. So here's our substrate. There's our bonds breaking, and now we have a new product. What else can they do? Well, they can also put stuff together, which is really cool. So they can make new bonds between substrates to form one product. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Here's our enzyme. There's our two substrates. Now we're forming bonds, and guess what? Now we have a product. So we took these little monomers and turned them into a polymer. So remember, mono means one, mer means number. So we took mono, so two things, and we made them poly. That means we have multiple things stuck together. So what are enzymes? They're proteins. What do? They catalyze reactions. How do they work? They do that by lowering the activation energy, so they help us get a reaction done. Why are they so important? Because they perform an amazing role in regulating all of these different feedback loops we're talking about in the body. All right, so cells can regulate metabolism by controlling how much enzyme is there. They can turn it on or off, so they can inhibit the enzyme, so they can block that binding site or that active site on our enzyme. They can also regulate that through something like chemical inhibitors, and you can also have environmental conditions that mess up enzymes and don't allow them to do their job, and that's like that pH and temperature. So why do we need to regulate pH and temperature? Well, because if they're not regulated, enzymes can't do their job, metabolism doesn't work, and now you are sick and bad shape. All right, and that's it for today, guys. Stay curious. Thank you. Bye.